Dimensioning Styles and Variables, Chapter 29. Hi, Joe Cerrone. Today we're going to talk about how dimension styles are created in AutoCAD. And as we look at the learning objectives, we're looking at how to be able to work within the Dimension Style Manager and to be able to save and restore dimension styles and how to create these different dimension styles and families and apply them and to override them, match them to other dimension styles, and just some basic guidelines for working with dimensions. So let's get started. So the concepts are that you're able to create a dimension style just like a text style for a Word document, and it's going to have certain attributes associated with it. And so in this example they show the Fit tab and how the dim scale variables can be adjusted. And as we work with different types of dimension styles, we have regular dimension styles, and then they have this annotative dimensioning style, which is a little complicated. We don't do this in the first class because it automatically adjusts the dimension styles. And so in the first class we manually scale the dimensions and set the text heights for those. And so as you look at dimension styles, like we were talking about, it's like a word processor where you can just have a template with the different styles that you want to use for different dimensions. Now we'll use the D2L system, and then if we go into the content area and we were to look at our title blocks, the dimension styles are different for a mechanical versus an architectural dimension style. So if we look at an architectural dimension style, when we work with an architectural drawing, we'll have a dimension style that will allow us to set the scale for different scale ratios, like 1/4 of an inch equals a foot. And then if we were to look at the different attributes, I will usually work these tabs from left to right when I teach the course. And so when we look at the modifications that we want to the standard dimension style, they have first off the lines tab, which goes through things like what color the lines are and the line types. We don't change too much of this. Extend beyond the ticks would be, here's the tick mark, and that's how much would extend. Baseline spacing 3/8 means that it's 3/8 of an inch from this line here to the first dimension. And that's variable. If you use the automatic baseline command, then it spaces them 3/8. Otherwise it just puts it where you place it with the mouse. And then just some general information. We don't really change too much in the first tab. On the second tab we have, for the architectural dimension style, tick marks. And so you can change these. If we wanted to have dots, we could change them to dots, and you'd have dots. That's the arrowhead size. And then center marks, it talks a little bit about center marks. That's this part right here. And if you have it set up as a line, you'll get an X. If you have it set up as a mark, you'll get a small tick. And then the 3/30 seconds kind of goes into how much gap spacing is there. And it's called dim ticks. It's in the textbook. Text goes to what type of text you're using. We're going to use the standard text font. And then if we look at what that standard text font is, it's an Arial font. And we don't put text heights when we work with dimension styles in text, because the text heights are acquired on the Fit tab, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can change the text style if you don't want to use Arial. If you want to use something like City Blueprint, which looks more handwritten, you can change it to City Blueprint. I can apply that, close it, and now the letters are in that City Blueprint font. And then, you know, some of the things like place a frame around it. You can do all kinds of things with it, but essentially in the text style we don't really change too much of it, and we leave it at 1/8 of an inch height. We don't go and adjust these text heights because the text heights are adjusted in the scale factor. And so when we use a scale factor of 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, our scale factor is 48, which is the common denominator. So 0.25 equals 12, and then we have 4 times that for our scale. So it's a quarter of an inch equals a foot. Our common denominator or our factor is 48. Essentially, it's the inverse of the plot scale. And we can talk about that as we go through. But for right now, it's all set up so that when you work with a dimension on an architectural drawing, the value of that dimension text height will be set on the Fit tab. And there's a couple of ways. You can either use the overall scale or you can scale it to dimension layout, which works really great. And I'll give a quick demo on that. And then the primary units, architectural, it puts it in feet and inches versus if you had something in decimal. And so we can change out the units. But again, we have them set in the architectural title block. If you wanted to have alternate units and you wanted it to show in millimeters, you can have a 25.4 scale factor and apply, and you can have dual dimensions. So if you're producing something out of the country where they use the metric system, you can dual dimension those drawings just by checking off display alternate units and then setting the multiplier factor. Zero suppression will come in and use every once in a while. I typically don't like to have zeros in front of my numbers, so I'll suppress them. Tolerances, if we were going to work with a tolerance, you'll see this on more of the mechanical prints. And so that's how the dimension style manager looks. And then if we were to look at something like this door here, what we do is we draw the object in model space and then we create the dimensions on the dimension layer in model space at this point. And so if I were to take off this dimension here and then we wanted to reapply that, I could say I want a linear dimension from this endpoint to this endpoint, and I want it placed right there. Now notice how the dimension text height is super small. That's because the dimension is not being associated with the proper dimension style. And so when I look at the dimension style, this one's on this one here instead of on this one here. This is a larger scale, and so if I wanted to put this on a different dimension style, I can click on that and then I can go and find my dimension style manager. So in the Home tab under annotation here, here's where you can see the styles, and so I can switch this style from that one to a different style. And so if I go with our standard style, or if I go with a larger style, or with a smaller style, I can do that. And so I can create those different dimension styles. Another thing that we can do is we can use match property to match to an existing style. So if I click on this one and I want to know what kind of style is that, it tells me that it's on the CC arc dimension style. And if I want to, I can match properties for that with the match properties command. And I can say source, clone, and it will then match the properties of that. Another thing that we can do if we were to turn off this dimension layer, and then we just make a new dimension layer. So we'll say new and we'll call it dimension 2, and we'll make that on and we'll make that red, and we'll say OK, and we'll make that current. And so now I'm able to dimension with that current layer. And if I wanted to make a dimension style that automatically sets up the dimension text heights, I can double click in the viewport, and it's currently set at 1 inch equals a foot. And in my dimension style, one of the techniques that you can do is to create a new style. And so I could just say new, and I could call it viewport, and I can continue. And then I can set the Fit tab to scale the dimension to layout. And so this will automatically set it up so that it scales within the viewport when I use this dimension style. And I can set it current, close it, and then when I go through and I start putting in my dimensions, my text heights are automatically calculated. This is a great feature for architectural drawings and getting the text heights properly sized. All right, continuing. So we're able to create these different dimension styles, and it'll copy the standard style, and then you can go through and you can modify them. And so as you work with your dimension style manager, like this one is a mechanical drawing, you're able to then go through and set up how that dimension is going to look when you apply it. We don't use the annotative dimensions so much in this course. We save those for the upper level courses, but what that will do is automatically size the dimension heights for you. Right now it's fine if you just use the standard title block. If you use the architectural or the mechanical title block, it has dimension style set up for you. And so as we go through, there's a lot of different overrides and different modifications, but once we get into actually how to set up the style a few more pages ahead, in the dimension variables, we'll take a look at that. And so as we look at the dimension variables, like we said, you start off with the lines tab, and then you can go into symbols and arrows, text, fit, etc. And then you can adjust those different things, like if you change the color or the line type within that, you can have like dashed lines or a different color. And then you can adjust the line weight, you can adjust the extend beyond the dimension ticks, you know, all the minutiae stuff that a CAD manager would want on the drawings to make the drawings look professional and up to standards. And line weights, line types, you can suppress a dimension. Mostly I will use properties, and so I'll just put the dimension on there, and then if there's a properties that I want to suppress a dimension, you can do that within the properties tab. And so as you look at things like this, and if I click on that and then I go to the properties, you can go through and then you can look at what you would want to change if you did want to change anything within that. And so if I wanted to change the extension line colors, I want those to be magenta, and then it will only change that property for the one. And so that's typically how I'll update the dimension properties when I work with these different drawings. All right, continuing. Symbols and arrows, as we talked about, you can just change the arrowheads and symbols and things like that. Leaders, again, different arrowhead style, dot versus arrow. Sizes of the dimensions are pretty standardized. Here's our dim-sen. We talked briefly about that. You know, the dim-sen value, this 0.09 and minus 0.09, is the amount between this part right here and here, or this part right here and here. Some very minutiae aspects that you can set up the dimension styles with. Things like jogging, scale factors, text tab. Text tab controls the font and the text height. Typically we leave these as 1/8 of an inch, and then what we do is we scale the dimension on the fit tab. So text heights by default are 0.18. I think in the 117 class intermediate we standardized them at 0.125 or 1/8 of an inch. And then if you wanted to have the text bigger or smaller, you adjust the dim scale factor, and then everything is adjusted automatically. And so on this fit tab, like I demonstrated, you can either scale the dimensions to the layout or you just calculate them, and we have them pretty well worked out for you already on our standard title blocks. Again, we don't do so much with the annotative because it automatically does things. It's a little trickier to use. Suppression, dimension extension lines, fine-tuning, being able to work with the dimensions. There's a ton of things that you can get caught up with, but essentially you just want to be able to understand how the Dimension Styles tab works. In the primary units, you can adjust the precision, and so this is what the precision will be placed on the dimensions. So the more decimal precision, like this one has 4 decimal places, the more expensive and the harder it is to make those parts. And so typically mechanical parts will be a 3-dimensional place accuracy if it's, you know, kind of a standard mechanical part. If you get into rough stuff that's not real accurate, you might have 2-dimensional places of accuracy. And then if you're like aerospace quality, you'll want like 5-dimensional accuracy units. And so as we put in these dimensions, it shows how you can update these different settings for the dimension fraction displays and how it separates the dimensions. Suffixes, you can add millimeters, or you could add the word typical. Sometimes we'll add a prefix to them. Suffixes and prefixes can be added in the dimension styles. Scale factor we don't do so much work with. You can, if you do, it will change things and kind of goof it up. And so when if you change this factor and you draw something 3 inches and then you have your Dimmel scale factor at 2, when you put a dimension on it, doubles it. So this is not a good idea to use that. Zero suppression, you can turn it off so that you don't have a 0 in front. And it depends on the precision for how much decimal accuracy that will be. Alternate units, you can enable alternate units, and if you have a conversion factor for millimeters, you can place that in there, and then you can have both imperial and millimeter dimensions. We would do this quite a bit for some of the manufacturing that we did in the United States. We use inches. When we would make things in Brazil, we would use millimeters. So we would dual dimension our drawings. And then just placement, how that's placed, how you want to set up your dimension style. People can be kind of picky about that. Typically a CAD manager will set these things up. Things for mechanical people like dimension tolerances, this part has to be accurate within 3 inches plus or minus 5 thousandths or 3 thousandths of an inch. And so this value 0.003 would be about the thickness of a piece of paper. And so that's very accurate when we get into mechanical designs. That's common. And then you can add alternate units, some other values that are variables that you can set up. Associativity, we talked about that in our last chapter lecture. We want things associated, so when we update the size of the part, the dimensions update automatically. And then we use templates, and so our architectural print has a template with all of the settings already in there and the dimension styles. And so that's what a good CAD manager will do for you, is that he will set up, or she will set up, the dimension styles and then provide a standard title block. Properties allows you to change anything on any drawing within the dimension styles, and so you can go through and you can change things around with properties, things like suppressing extension lines or removing center marks. Overrides I don't really use so much. If the dimension doesn't come out and work right, I just put it in again. I'll erase it and try it again. And so match properties is a great way to match to existing properties of other dimensions. You might get a dimension that's on there and you're like, what style is this used? You can just match it, or you can just go and analyze it in the properties command. As we talked about annotative dimensioning, we use this in the intermediate to the advanced course. Automatically sizes your dimension scales. And then they talk a little bit about how to dimension objects and set up these different dimension styles and some of the overrides for those. And so that's the game. We want a dimension that's set up, a dimension style that's set up. And then dimensioning in paper space. I gave that example of how you can set up the dimension style, and this is primarily used in architectural drawings. They show a mechanical here, but primarily when you have viewports and you have it set to dimension scale within the viewport, we'll have the architectural one, and then we'll have 2 or 3 different scales, and it'll automatically scale it. It's a great feature. So they talk a little bit about how to dimension in paper space. Again, we'll go through the basics with it. It was just like I showed, where you just tag the endpoints of the lines and you have those settings. Annotative dimensions, again, automatic, advanced. And so they have this set up for the annotative ones where they will adjust to the scales of the viewports. And it's a little bit complicated. So here's a 2 viewport drawing, and then by having different dimension styles set up, they can keep it so it looks consistent, because the idea is that this drawing here and this drawing here, the text heights print out on the paper the same size, neat and organized. And they talk a little bit about dimensioning isometric drawings, and we really do 3D drawings now more so than isometric. And so they have this obliquing factor if you wanted to do isometric. And I'm quite good with isometric. I used to teach it up at NIU. Pictorial projections, making things look 3-dimensional that are 2-dimensional. But now we just model them, and we can have a full-blown 3D model that has a lot more use than in isometric. But isometrics are great for getting visualization. If you're not familiar with how an object looks, you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like, rather than looking at it flat in the top, front, and right side view. All right, and then it just gets into the chapter exercises where it wants you to create these different dimension styles. We have our own assignments for that. When we work on this chapter, we'll be working with mechanical and architectural drawings. Here's our mechanical drawing, and there are instructions on how to create the dimensions for that within the D2L. And then here's our architectural drawing. Alrighty, with that, I'm going to stop the recording and post it. That ends the lecture for chapter 29.